at the Mauritius Revenue Authority. We also have with us Arvin Alkori, Senior Associate Barrister at Jurisconsult Chambers. With us also Kevin Ramkalon. He's the CEO of Business Mauritius, which is the apex institution of the business community in Mauritius. Kevin, hi. And last but not least, Roshan Natu, Managing Director, Corporate for Rogers Capital. We'll be joined later during the discussion by other panelists and other guests, but for now, we are coming to you live through Zoom, and I would just like to get out of the picture some housekeeping rules. As you can see, we have lots of open mics here, so we would really like for you to make sure that your mics are muted, but of course, you can send in your questions to Rogers Capital, and we'll be taking some of the questions at the end of each segment. So let's start by Roshan Natu. Roshan, I would like to ask you to what extent the COVID situation has brought additional challenges and uncertainty to the Mauritian government's overarching plan and ambition to boost investment and also the economy while engaging into major structural reforms.
Okay. Thanks, Hamid. So every group of companies, and even the government for that matter, would normally have a strategic plan which spans over 3 to 5 years and sometimes even more. And those strategic plans are based on certain assumptions. For example, in the case of the government, it would be tax revenue. In the case of someone operating the hotel industry, it would be tourist arrivals. What the COVID has done is to wipe out all those assumptions, meaning that everyone has to start from scratch, go back to the blackboard. So this is the situation that everyone is in right now. But there is, I must say, a positive twist to it, if I may put it that way, a silver lining to the dark clouds that surround us. I think in times of crisis, trends are accelerated. Changes can be made quicker. And one trend which has actually accelerated and which we can see is probably the remote of everything. In our case, in our business, during the lockdown, we have worked from home. All our staff have worked from home. It's something that we started off, but it has accelerated during the lockdown. I think for the government, there are opportunities to be seized there, like more online of government, dealings with government to be more through the certain technological platforms as opposed to people queuing up for licenses, for processing, etc. So this is something which has started already, but which can be accelerated. One other aspect that I can think of is in these times of crisis where people may be losing jobs, I think schemes to boost entrepreneurship would be the order of the day, because people may be more willing to take risks in these sort of difficult times. So these are, I think, the opportunities that we can capitalize upon, that we can capture, even if there is a crisis.
So, Kevin Ramkalon, yesterday, the finance minister actually kicked off a dialogue platform with the business community. The challenges linked to the COVID context are, I guess, still high on the agenda, and it was still high on the agenda during yesterday's discussion, right?
Yes, indeed, Ravin. I think those challenges of a COVID lockdown have to be realized. I mean, this country has been in lockdown for 10 weeks. I think we've done better sanitary-wise than many other countries, but we are an export-oriented economy, and we have to face a global context of contraction, of uncertainty. Worse than contraction is also the uncertainty. IMF is talking about uncertain times. Every day is a different day. And Mauritius, as we do policy making, as businesses go back to the drawing board, we have to have a long-term view, but we also have to be able to manage day-to-day. And that challenge shouldn't be underestimated. Right now, we're talking about a contraction of the economy for this year of around 13%, but that is based again on assumptions. how quickly we reopen our borders completely, how quickly different sectors actually pick up on the global economy. There's also the fact that we look at consumption, local, international, and the investment frameworks and the investment confidence of entrepreneurs at this very difficult juncture. For Mauritius, I think it's quite an interesting story. We need to be able to look at it also sector-wise because of this micro level of understanding of how things are moving. Tourism obviously is our worst hit sector. Tourism is around, with direct and indirect, around 12%, but with induced catalytic factor around 25% of the economy. Tourism is having issues and is trying to reinvent itself. And I think there's a lot of discussions and policy direction when it comes to tourism. The manufacturing sector, however, which is also a very important component of our economy, is finding itself in a space that's perhaps not as bad as we expected at the lockdown and in the beginning of the COVID crisis. Mauritius is actually a leader when it comes to casual wear, and with the work from home trends worldwide, casual wear is actually becoming a very important component of the manufacturing sector. At the same time, with the nearshoring, with the whole concept of access to goods, local manufacturing is also seeing itself picking up. So there is some hope in manufacturing. Obviously, the financial services, one of our pillars, facing other factors apart from COVID. But so far, we've seen some level of resilience, and it really is about being sure that we do the right things and seeing the sector be able to pick up. Financial services was a driver of growth, but probably a little bit less right now, but at least it's maintaining itself. ICT is seeing actually some very interesting growth potential. With lockdown happening, with the internationalization of work from home, in fact, some of our operators are seeing growth in their business, and we need to be able to capitalize on it. Obviously, our other sectors, agriculture and all, are facing some issues. I just quickly wanted to bring some point that in a COVID-safe environment, in the fact that Mauritius is one of the countries which is known for its attractiveness as a base for doing business in the region, those things haven't changed. There are some fundamentals on which we need to continue working, such as ease of doing business, ensuring that the cost of doing business from this remote location remains competitive. But there are some fundamentals on which we can continue working, and those must be looked at in a long-term way. So there's some short-term, quick measures that we need to implement, but we also have to continue this long-term discussion. Thank you, Arvin.
Let's turn to Arvin. Arvin, mid-May, the COVID Act was passed by Parliament in Mauritius. According to you, did this complex piece of legislation, because actually the COVID Act changed laws, 46 different laws, if my memory serves me right, did this complex piece of legislation actually start setting the stage for what we've seen in the Finance Act in terms of measures?
In fact, as you rightly pointed out, Rabin, the COVID Act was passed mid-May when we were in total lockdown, and the COVID Act amends 56 legislations. So just to give a brief background of the COVID Act, I can categorize those amendments into three main components. So the first one is precisely where there was an extension in time limit, so whether you have to pay your CEB bill, your CWA bill, fixed penalty notices, so all the time extension to apply for a particular license, these time limits were extended. Occupation permit, residence permit. So this is the first limb of the law, which extend a number of time limits that would usually expire during that COVID period. And the COVID period was defined from the 23rd of March to the 1st of June. The second limb of that law, I would say, makes some en passant amendments. A few penalties were increased in the criminal code. We had this new offense of spitting in public. A few penalties under the Light Railway Act the penalties were increased. And the third limb of that law, which is the main one, is where I would say there were 5 main changes. So the first change was to the Bank of Mauritius Act, where now the Bank of Mauritius could make advances to the government again, in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, to assist in fiscal measures and to stabilize the economy. The ceiling on public debt was repealed. This was one of the main, let's say, amendments that was brought. The second one was having to do with fiscal measures, income tax incentives. So you had the wage assistance scheme, the self-employed assistance scheme, and tax deduction for those persons who are contributing to the COVID Solidarity Fund. The third limb was, again, with a view to facilitate business. The Insolvency Act was amended to increase, let's say, the time limit which was given to companies which were served with statutory demand to comply with the same. So there was some kind of easing of companies who were in distress situation. We also had, again, within this mindset of easing, let's say, the difficulties of the business community, we had this major amendment to the Lord and Tenant Act where there was a window given to tenants for the payment of their rental from March to August 2020. And lastly, as the earlier panelists said, we discovered the positive thing out of the COVID was that we could work remotely. So the Workers' Rights Act was amended to at least allow the minister to come forward with regulations for work from home. And these regulations were only last week made. So these are the main amendments that were made. So when we look at the context in which those amendments were made, as Kevin said, we had to take short-term measures at that point in time. So these amendments for me are short-term measures that were taken, but to some extent, they do set the stage for, let's say, opening up the economy, for boosting up investment, which can be seen later to be embodied in the Finance Act.
We'll discuss those in a couple of minutes. Let's turn to Mr. Noor Mohamed Ouzier now. So let's dive right into specifics. Could you maybe elaborate for those who are watching us on the incentives and other support schemes that were put in place for sectors most severely, like Kevin was mentioning before, impacted by the COVID situation?
Yes, Mauritius, I must say, has been very proactive in taking measures to support the different sectors of the economy. I mean, we can say that there are, it was done in three stages. You will recall that Mauritius has taken the necessary measures before the lockdown. The lockdown occurred around 18th of March, but certain measures were announced around, I think, the 13th of March for support to the business sector, to enable the business sector to face the downturn and relating to the COVID pandemic. The repo rate was reduced by 0.5%. And also there was a scheme, the Back Mauritius Special Relief Program, which gave the economic operator the possibility to take loans with a reduced rate of interest of 2.5% and a moratorium of 6 months. There was also the facility for existing loans to have a moratorium of 6 months, and also a measure for those enterprises that were affected by the COVID pandemic to have a double tax deduction where they invested in plant and machinery. So these were the measures that were announced prior to the lockdown. Now, during the lockdown, of course, there are some other measures that became, I mean, very, very urgent, because during the lockdown, employees didn't go to work, employers didn't get revenue. So there was the fear that these employees may lose their job, in the sense that the employers may not have the resources to pay the salaries. There are also the self-employed. We're talking about nearly half of the population who are like in a very difficult situation. So during the lockdown, you will recall that even 2 days after the lockdown, the minister announced a series of measures. I can say that the two main measures that were announced was the wage assistance scheme and the self-employed assistance scheme. The wage assistance scheme was put in place even during lockdown, and all applications and details were furnished online, and this was, as you said, Roshan said, an opportunity for the enterprises.
And it was
the tax
administered by the
administration, yeah, it was administered by the MRA, to put in place all the systems during lockdown and capitalize on our arrangements for work from home, because all these were done from from home facilities. In fact, you rightly said, we were like a bit trying to do it, but then the COVID-19, the lockdown gave us the opportunity to put in place, and we really did it. 15,000 employers were paid. And today we can say that we have paid, government has paid more than 11 billion rupees as support. We have the wage assistance scheme to employers to help them to pay their salaries of their employees. For employees having a salary of up to 50,000, we have also the self-employed assistance scheme for those who are in the formal sector as well as in the informal sector. We need to realize that persons who are individuals who are in the informal sector, they are really in a very bad position during the lockdown, in the sense that without revenue, things may go wrong. So government acted very promptly and put in place this assistance scheme, and we have some 200,000 individuals, self-employed, have been paid wage assistance.
So how did the Finance Act build upon that?
Yeah, in fact, what happened? This was included in the COVID bill, in the COVID Act, and there was also, after the lockdown, the issue about the tourism industry, because if gradually activities started to gain momentum and to start again, but we were on a complete stop and complete lockdown, if we can say, for the tourism sector. So there are a number of measures that were taken for the tourism sector, and after the lockdown, the wage assistance scheme and the self-employed assistance scheme continued for the tourism sector, and it's ongoing until now, because we're still under the borders are closed, and these operators do not have any income, so these measures are still ongoing.
Kevin Ramkalon, maybe could you tell us a little bit about how the business community is actually benefiting in real terms from these measures, and maybe elaborate a little bit on what do you think are these additional incentives that might be needed to accompany these businesses struggling?
Maybe I'll start by perhaps rejoining my friend here. I think the wage assistance support during the lockdown was very decisive. At a point where most businesses were making zero revenue, we could have seen a massive laying off. But instead of that, there was a certain partnership to be able to maintain employment, because out of employment is productive capacity being maintained. Therefore, to understand that scheme, to some level of workers, government contributed fully to their salary. As we move upwards to a certain ceiling, government contributed up to half of their salary, and above a certain ceiling, the employers did the effort. This whole structuring managed to keep some strength of the productive capacity for after the lockdown. As we move forward, I think it's been a lot of sacrifice from the government, from the employees also, and from the employers. Employees, because particularly at the higher rungs, there's been a lot of voluntary cuts that have taken place, and employers have continued to play the game despite a very, very reduced level of earnings. But that is one part of the equation. It's the employment, the furlough schemes, a little bit what has been implemented around the world, and which is now that most countries are moving out of lockdown or are finding other ways of financing. There are different methods. You've got the UK, the Anglo-Saxon method. You've got something happening in Germany, which is also quite interesting, where it is funding directly the employee, talking about how things can move as we move forward, because there's a balance. There's a balance about productive capacity and ensuring efficiency of the economy and certain agility of businesses that needs to be taken into account. But another scheme, and I think touched a little bit earlier on, which is very, very important, is how do you ensure that businesses, distressed companies, who suddenly do not have the same forecasts in the coming months or years because your business has been transformed and is being transforming, how do you ensure that you're given sufficient ammunition to be able to recover and transition or reinvent yourself? And I think there are two particular aspects that I'd like to bring out. There is in Mauritius something that's been created called the MIC, the Mauritius Investment Corporation. It's a sovereign wealth fund, in fact, but called the MIC here and within the purview of the Bank of Mauritius. The MIC provides a certain level of capital injection to businesses that have strong fundamentals, particularly in the way we see the future, but maybe are currently distressed companies. And in the thinking behind the MIC, by injecting capital at the top of the balance sheet, you're able to help those companies also look at their debt situation and be able to work with banks in a better way. Because the financial system must be preserved. It's the bloodline of the economy. So MIC has been able to work with the larger companies at the level of capital, and for the smaller companies, there's been a combination of work with the Development Bank of Mauritius, which is a sort of industrial bank, but really more around development. The Development Bank of Mauritius and the State Investment Corporation working out a certain system of cheap loans. And linking that with an equity fund also, which is called the SME Equity Fund, to be able to do the same thing with capital and debt. Those arrangements, in fact, have some of them have a certain time in which they're going to be implemented, and in fact, the timeline is December. And we think that firstly, there must be some thinking about how to extend the timeline because of the interlinkages between the banking system and the different facilities. We also think that there needs to be perhaps some acceleration at the level of the MIC. Obviously, I think it's now moving forward. It's a new scheme and a new setup, and I think it needs to move forward. But also, I think at the level of the smaller companies, although debt is cheaper, there's still collateral requirements which are difficult to engage at this particular time in the economy. And therefore, there needs to be a certain flexibility, we believe, that needs to be brought in. Obviously, government and ourselves and the business community are in discussions and keep talking on these subjects to ensure that at least the different priorities are met, because it is not also right to be able to fund use money to fund companies that would be not able to recover. So there's this balancing act, but I think we are able to find solutions by sitting around the table and discussing.
Oshanatu, any ideas about any specific additional incentives or schemes that might be needed in this context?
Just general comment. I think in these periods of crisis, it's obviously absolutely imperative that the government intervenes, whether it's through incentives or spending or investments, etc. We unfortunately received the statistics for the second quarter of this year. So household consumption are down by almost, domestic spending are down by almost more than 30%. So it's a lot. So government has to intervene to bridge in the gap of spending to keep the economy going. That being said, the government intervention will only be for the short term mostly, so it cannot carry on. We are an open economy, an economy which is export oriented. So particular attention is being given to, and will have to be continued to be given to export oriented industries, like the hotel industry, the global business, the manufacturing industry. So these are sectors on which additional focus will have to be given, so that in the medium to long term, we get out of this crisis with as little damage as possible.
Kevin Ramkalon, coming back to you, the level of institutional dialogue between the government of Mauritius and the business community is usually celebrated, and actually there is quite a huge level of discussion before any finance act is is passed between the business community and the government. And usually one of the aspects of the discussion is usually business facilitation and competitiveness. To what point this Finance Act that was just voted ticks the right boxes in terms of business facilitation policy?
You see, business facilitation is a long-term project and that we've been engaging on as a country. We cannot not recognize the very, very good ranking of Mauritius on the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business report. I think Mauritius has gone very far and is going very far on that level. I'd like to just perhaps explain a little bit. Firstly, there is the development of an e-licensing system, which means that as you move forward, permits are given on an online system, and that obviously helps you to monitor, to ensure that you're meeting all the right KPIs. There's also a second level, which is called the business process reengineering of permits. And that has been done with international partners, with the EU as a key partner, to see what permit system, what kinds of licensing we should be looking at in the future. And that has brought certain results in the way we look at permits, but it is a long-term project. There are many, many more things that need to be implemented, and we need to continue on that level. The third area, which is also very interesting when it comes to business facilitation, is the idea of a regulatory impact assessment. And that's a third level of project that we're working on, so that we ensure that before policies are put in place, you actually have the impact assessment of those policies. And for us, this is very much key as we move forward. But business facilitation on a systemic way, I think has been addressed, and there are many things that are happening. But we need to be extremely vigilant. Today, with the lockdown, with the differences in the trade patterns, for example, there are new concerns, ensuring port efficiency, ensuring airport connectivity. All that is business facilitation. And I think it is not right to expect that a Finance Act resolves all that. I think it's a continuous dialogue, and that needs to be part of an ongoing conversation and an ongoing solutions-driven dialogue.
Ocean Natu, Rogers Capital is involved in the global business industry. The Finance Act also actually modifies the Immigration Act and the Economic Development Board Act on matters relating to residency and employment of non-residents. Will these changes, according to you, affect positively business facilitation in Mauritius?
Absolutely, Amit. What we have to probably grasp is that us as a jurisdiction, we don't operate in a bubble. As a jurisdiction, we are in competition with other jurisdictions, with other countries, with other centers. And the whole idea is to make ourselves as attractive as possible, so that when vying for skills, for investments, etc., people think of Mauritius, and we are able to attract those. There are some changes which obviously have been brought in the recent recently in the EDB Act and the Immigration Act. Some of those which I particularly like. There's one which is about it's a bit of a mouthful, business obstacle alert mechanism, which is essentially a system, which is an online system, which identifies bottleneck. Any applicant for a license can log in any bottlenecks that he's experiencing, and he gets regular feedback about where the process is, where the license is. This is absolutely essential these days to make sure that we are able to promote our country as an efficient place to do business. The other parts are the other changes are in the Immigration Act. The rules to work and live in Mauritius have been further relaxed. For example, these days, the amount of investments required for you to obtain an occupation, a residence permit, has been halved. So it's about $50,000 now. The residency, the period of permanent residency, has been increased from 10 years to 20 years. People who were under a permanent residency scheme, which was for a period of 10 years, this 10 years has now been extended to 20 years. So So these are all positive signs. And people may ask, so why is all of this required? Because with a population of 1.3 billion, there's only so much that we can do and that we can grow. So we need critical mass, we need spending, we need more people coming here, working and living here. Just to make a comparison with, we like obviously to talk about the Singapore success story. In a population of about 5.7 million people in Singapore, about 3.5 of them are citizens and 2.2 are actually non-citizens working there. So this is to give you an idea about how much, when you open up the economy, you open up the country to foreign skills, foreign investments, and foreign people coming and working there, how much more you can do, because you need that critical mass.
Arvin Alkori, your one of your specializations, is in the area of fintech. And Roshan was just talking about people and talents. Let's talk about technology and laws that enable the proper use of technology and fintech specifically. The Finance Act contains specific measures relating to digital banking and also digital currencies. Will these favor new types of and sources of investment and business in Mauritius?
I mean, the Finance Act does make provision for the Bank of Mauritius to deliver digital bank licenses and also allows the Bank of Mauritius to come forward with digital currencies. This is an activity which obviously can be explored in the long run, but this activity in itself, in my view, is not sufficient to unleash the full potential of the digital economy. We should not forget that over the last few years, over the last 5 years, systematically the Finance Acts have been adding, let's say, more ingredients towards this digital economy, towards this fintech ecosystem. I call it an ecosystem because it is a whole ecosystem that in fact we are selling. We need a full package because each component in that ecosystem should go in the same direction. So what the EDB is trying to sell, the regulatory bodies like the FSC, the banks should follow. The present Finance Act contains the digital bank license, but it also contains something which is very interesting, is the peer-to-peer lending, which has been added as one of the financial business activities which would now be licensed by the FSC. And shortly after the enactment of the Finance Act, the FSC did come forward with the peer-to-peer lending rules. As I think Kevin was saying earlier, the cost of obtaining finance has gone down, but still businesses, small entrepreneurs needed some kind of collateral, which at times it's very difficult for them. So this peer-to-peer lending can in a way help those startups, help those entrepreneurs, because basically what is happening here is there is an operator, someone will be licensed by the FSC to operate a peer-to-peer lending platform, and the lending platform, the aim of that platform would be to connect borrowers and lenders. But obviously here we are talking of small amounts. People cannot, for instance, lend more than 3 million rupees within a period of 12 months over a lending platform. But this kind of finance will definitely boost startups and entrepreneurs, be it in the digital field or in other fields.
Now, Arvin Alkori, since you have the floor, let's talk a little bit and acknowledge the presence of the elephant in the room, and the elephant that made quite a little bit of mess. Since October 1st, Mauritius is officially on the EU list of countries having strategic deficiencies in their AML-CFT regimes, commonly referred to as the EU Blacklist. How did we come to this?
Well, maybe we didn't foresee it, but this is a direct consequence, in my view, of the FATF grey list on which we were placed back in February, I think end of January, early February of this year. So in January, end of January, the FATF had placed us on their grey list of jurisdictions which required an increased monitoring. And the EU had, in the meantime, revised its methodology of, let's say, assessing the risk of countries, and as part of its methodology, it relies heavily on the FATF methodology. So the moment we were on the FATF grey list of increased monitoring, it could have been foreseen that a natural consequence, a direct consequence of that would have been that the EU would have placed us on their list of high-risk countries. As you rightly said, they view Mauritius, together with other 10 countries, that we have strategic deficiencies in our AML-CFT framework, and those strategic deficiencies, in fact, pose significant risk to the EU itself while dealing with Mauritius. The EU identified 5 strategic deficiencies for Mauritius, if you allow me to rapidly go through them. So they found a deficiency in our ability to implement a risk-based supervision for the global business sector. They found that we failed to ensure an access to accurate beneficial ownership information in a timely manner. They found that we also failed to demonstrate that law enforcement agencies had the capacity to conduct complex money laundering investigations. They found that we failed to implement a risk-based supervision for non-profit organizations. And lastly, they found that we failed to demonstrate that we had adequately implemented targeted financial sanctions through an outreach and supervision exercise. So in the meantime, from the time that we were informed that we would be placed on the blacklist, a number of measures have been taken by government and the business community, including global business sector, to try to solve, let's say, those 5 major deficiencies.
We'll talk about the actions being taken, but let me turn to Roshan Natu now. Roshan, how does this blacklisting impact the Mauritian economy at large and the very specific sectors like yours, global business?
Okay. I think we can summarize the impact twofold. So the first one is that immediately, or even before slightly, the 1st of October, certain financial institutions and certain professionals will have to exercise enhanced due diligence in their transactions, in their business dealings with Mauritius. So there would be additional scrutiny by banks, insurance companies, lawyers, accountants, and all that in all their transactions with Mauritius. Secondly, there will be issues regarding EU funding to Mauritius, EU funds going through Mauritius. And here I would like, just as an aside, to mention that it's EU funds only. It's not country funds or sovereign funds, for example, funds from Germany, the German government, or the Spanish government. It's EU funds. So there will be restrictions on funding to Mauritius because of that blacklist. Now, what does that mean in terms of everyday business? So from a global business perspective, what we've seen is that clients have remained loyal. They have been with us, they have known us for so many years, and they know that this is going to pass. But there is only so much time, probably, that they would be willing or able to wait. That being said, everything that could be done has been done so far to make sure that we are out of the list as soon as possible. So representations have been made, laws have been changed, there's a broader sort of training awareness among different stakeholders about what are the issues. So these have been made, and so hopefully by the first quarter of next year, if all goes well, we should be out of the list. So this is broadly what will be the impact on the global business sector. For the other sectors, there might be, although we have not seen much of it, there might be delays in making payments, transactions, and all of that. And then obviously there's the issue of funding. So this is in general where we foresee the problems to arise, but hopefully it will be short-lived, and obviously we can always grow out of it.
We'll talk about the way forward with Kevin Ramkalon in just a few moments, but let me first turn to Mr. Noor Mahmoud Ouzier. Could you please explain to us how this listing is actually impacting Mauritius from a tax perspective?
You know, here I think we should make the distinction between the FATF listing, SMLAG listing, or the EU Blacklist, because from a tax perspective, what's the relevant listing is the OECD listing. OECD is the organization that sets the standard as far as tax administration is concerned, as far as the internationally agreed tax standards. We, at a certain point, were not on the white list, but now that with the legislative changes that have taken place in Mauritius and the changes in our tax systems, we have been reviewed by the OECD with respect to our banking sector, all the incentives sectors, the offshore sector, we have the free port sector, all these have been reviewed, and we have passed this test so that today we are not on the blacklist of the OECD. So we are on the white list. I mean, yesterday on the 6th, I think the OECD EU published their list, and we are not on the white list. We are on the white list. So from a tax perspective, you can say that we are safe. We are not. There is no shortcomings.
So let me ask Kevin Ramkalon now. We all know here that getting Mauritius out of the list features as a topmost priority of government and the business community, and they're working together to make that happen. Could you tell us a little bit more about what is being done specifically to delist Mauritius, and how confident you are for us to meet this target of having Mauritius out of this list by the first quarter of 2021?
Perhaps a quick recap. We are on the EU blacklist because we are on the FATF increased monitoring list.
After an ISAMLAG assessment.
We get out of the FATF increased monitoring list by a set of measures which I think has been well described. Once we get out of it, in many other cases, it is not an automatic process for you to get out of the EU blacklist. In some cases, we understand that the EU has the privilege to see who it will take out of the list. But I think one of the important factors that we need to bring to the table is that, my understanding anyway, is the EU has indicated that if Mauritius gets out of the FATF list, there will be no what they call top-up conditions for Mauritius to get out of the EU list. This is a very important point, because once you do know this, the steps for getting out of the FATF is actually quite clear. When you do this, today, structurally, government and the business community are working together, I think at the highest level. There's a core group that follows all these actions that have been mentioned, and the core group includes business community people and the technicians also. The 2 points maybe also to add to this. Firstly, the project that is coming forward for financial crime court. I think that is a very, very important step in this equation, particularly because one of the areas where Mauritius needs to show more, to show its strength, is on the idea of effectiveness. And effectiveness is about being able to assess in court the different merits and demerits of financial crime cases. The second level of information, I think, which we need to also talk about is beyond the financial services sector, there's the designated non-financial businesses and professions that also must be looked at in this scheme of things. And I think Mauritius has done a lot, and these core groups are doing a lot to ensure that those that we were not maybe really focusing on as part of the AML-CFT regulations, the jewelers, the gambling associations, Mauritius has the oldest race court in this part of the world, well, in the southern hemisphere. All those were perhaps not being seen globally, but are being looked at through this core group work. So it's very systematic. Now, you're telling me about how confident we are. I think it's very, very difficult for any of us to actually come up with an exact date, but I think that what has to be done is being done. and the difficult issue of effectiveness. I think the idea of the financial court crime brings a lot of strength to that point of the equation. And yeah, I think this is what we need to look at. And my final word, perhaps on this subject, is maybe SAMLAG, FATF, EU Blacklist. It's a process. But what I agree is there is a commitment to go out of it. And when we do go out of it, because that I'm convinced that Mauritius will go out of it, because we are, as a country, convinced that we need to get out of it. When we do go out of it, the compliance structure of Mauritius, together with its ease of doing business and its position with regards to emerging Africa and with the powerhouses of Asia, I think it will put us in an incredible place. And that is something we should all work towards. And it's a very, very, it is really part of a strategic thrusts for the future of Mauritius.
We are reaching the end of the first section of our discussion, and we're taking a few questions. We have two questions that you've sent through the discussion panel in Zoom, and I'll ask the first one to Roshan, who will be leaving us just after this question, and thank you for joining us. Roshan, the question is the following. There are loads of questions around the reopening of borders. What is the impact of closed, open borders on investment?
It's a double-edged sword, isn't it? So on the one hand, it's a balancing act between health and safety of people, and which is absolutely legitimate and prime, and also the fact that we are an open economy, so we have to at some point open up to tourists coming in, to business traveling. I think we are proceeding in steps. We are gradually opening up the economy or the borders, not doing it at one go. This is a good start. But I also think that we have the benefit of hindsight. There are certain countries which have opened up maybe slightly more than us and before. Here I'm thinking of places like Singapore, New Zealand, Korea. So they've opened up, and they seem to have they pretty much contained the situation in these countries. So if there are any best practice or lessons to be learned, I think we should do that. We should learn from them, and whatever has been working there, replicate that in Mauritius. Because there's only so much history about the COVID, about how to deal with it, and we have to follow what other people have been successful at. I would think this would be the way forward.
Thank you, Roshan, and thank you for joining us.
Pleasure.
I have another question from the people who are watching us this time for Kevin. Kevin, someone who's watching us is asking, the world is changing very rapidly and quickly. New skills are required, obviously, in this changing world. And there may be some sectors that will no longer be the same after the COVID period. Are there any measures that you would think about to encourage professionals to actually change orientation and change sectors?
Yes, it's a very, very pertinent question. Maybe give an example and maybe give a bit of a thinking of how we are looking at this issue. Very right, and also the question talks about a long-term trend, but for Mauritius, even in the very, very short term, you're getting professionals who need to move out of the tourism sector, because tourism will not be back to normal certainly next year. As those professionals move out, they see other sectors such as ICT BPO, where this hospitality, this contact, this customer care is required. Therefore, what is really the plan for us right now is to be able, when people are exiting, professionals or skilled workers are exiting from a job, that we're able to do what is called a competency inventory. We're able to understand really at the micro level, Mauritius is small, we can do this, understand what kind of profiles are exiting from a sector, and then see if directly there's a match with another sector. Business Mauritius has members across all the sectors of the economy, and see if there's a direct match, and if yes, we go for it, and if not, then we need to talk about a reskilling program. And reskilling, the concept of reskilling and matching is a project that Business Mauritius is doing together with the HRDC, with the Human Resource Development Corporation of Council of Mauritius. So the government side of training and the business community trying to match and reskill. As we move forward in the future, then we're talking really about two things, about being able to bring it in the education sphere. And then the projects are extremely interesting because we are also going towards gender mainstreaming. Mauritius has one unexploited resource, I think, is that many of our trained graduate women are not in the workplace. And yet you have a demand for skills that are perfectly gender mainstream, whether in coding in the ICT sector or in the new renewable energy sectors, in circular economy. And we need to bring that to the schools so that we train our resources our professionals of tomorrow for the skills of tomorrow. This is much more complex though, because it actually goes onto the idea of culture and of mindset, and that needs to be changed.
Thank you, Kevin. You're watching us. We're live from Rogers House, and this is a webinar that has been organized by Rogers Capital to discuss about the Finance Act and the specific tax aspect and the economic aspect of the Finance Act. In the second part of the discussion, we'll be delving specifically on the tax aspect of the Finance Act. And to help us at that task, we are joined by two new guests. We have Richard Lee, who is an actuary. Thank you for joining us, Richard. And also Ryan Alas, who is the Executive Director Tax of Rogers Capital. And since you're here, Ryan Alas, let's start by taking a question for you. Tell us the main changes in the Finance Act from a tax perspective. What are they?
Thank you, Rabin. Hello to all the other panelists and all those who are following us live. In fact, the background to the Finance Act, the introduction of the Finance Act was quite challenging. We are already facing the challenges brought by the COVID-19 to our economy. And from a tax perspective, it can be said that we are no longer 100% sovereign. The government cannot enact any tax measures nowadays because there has been the OECD BEPS project, base erosion. We had been targeted. We had to change our legislation. 2 years ago, the Finance Act amended the whole taxation of our global business sector to eliminate any ring fencing features. And now, when any changes brought to our tax regime, we must be careful that they are not viewed as harmful by the OECD and the EU. And at the same time, the government had to find tax measures to raise revenue and at the same time provide incentive to the private sector. Among the incentive to the private sector, there has been tax incentives to encourage private capital expenditure. There has been introduction of tax credit on capital expenditure, investment allowance. It was in our tax legislation in the past. It has now come back. Investment allowance, which means that when you acquire a capital asset, you get not only a normal annual allowance, tax depreciation, but you get also an additional investment allowance. There has also been double tax deduction measures in respect of all those specifically targeted toward expenditure in the highly technological equipment, high precision technological equipment. And there has also been tax holidays that has been granted to a specific sectors like the pharmaceutical industry, like the aquaculture industry, and also to encourage top 500 universities in the world to set up branches in Mauritius. Those companies will benefit from 8-year tax holidays. And there have also been measures for individuals as well. Since a long time, we had a very strict definition for individuals of a dependent. This year, the Finance Act has introduced a new type of dependent. If you have a relative, a close relative which is bedridden, it can be taken as a dependent in your tax return. Of course, there has also been need for the government to introduce measures to get tax revenue. There has been a change in the rate of solidarity levy, and there has also been a decrease in the threshold to be eligible, to be subject to solidarity levy.
Thank you, Ryan. Let's turn to Kevin Ramkalon. How does Business Mauritius, Kevin, view the consistency and the pertinence of those tax changes?
Perhaps to start with, I think for us, tax discussions must take place in a regulatory impact assessment environment. It's extremely important as we move forward that any new taxes really look at the holistic impact on the economy. But perhaps then a little bit more specifically, you see, for the R&D technology innovation taxes, I look at it a little bit differently. The country was, well, at least in 2019, a high-income economy, and the aspiration is to become long-term a high-income economy. Well, we still are until the next report comes out. In a high-income economy, people have to be paid well, and we do agree, of course, that is what is necessary. When people are paid well, it is linked to their productivity. How much productivity do they bring into the equation for the Mauritian goods and services to be productive globally? Because we are an export-oriented economy. We compete on the global market. Whilst we do this, we see that in many sectors, particularly the manufacturing sector, but not only, there is a dire need to be able to move from labor-intensive to capital-intensive, to move towards adding marginal value towards high value, towards really transformation towards high value increase. And for those to happen, there's no other way than invest in a transition for companies to be able to deliver on high value, on innovation, on innovative products. So those tax measures are only part of the equation, but they're important. I think it's a signal, as a signaling mechanism for companies to move into this direction. But today there's a lot of work going on how to make Mauritius an innovation-driven country. And I think that debate needs to continue, and the work and the policy measures on that need to continue. But a short word on the solidarity levy, which is evidently very difficult because many of the Business Mauritius members, in fact, today are looking at Mauritius headquarters for the regional and for the international setup. And in there, we need to attract international talents to come in. And those international talents can be Mauritian diaspora, Mauritian people who've really mastered their areas of expertise. And in that too, there's a war for talent, there's a global competition. And the more difficult we make it for international talents and high value resources to set up and stay in Mauritius, the harder it is for us to meet our development agenda, our high income agenda. So balance must be made between ensuring redistribution, which is, I think, very fair, and everyone from the Business Mauritius membership is about a shared prosperity for the country. But whilst doing that, we must also look at the role of Mauritius as a center for the region, as a global place for doing business, and we need to find that balance. And I think we need to continue the conversation on this balance with government.
Thank you. Arvin Alcor, in a nutshell, this question of coherence and consistency is coming up quite a few times. Are these changes brought to the fiscal system comprehensive to you, or do they favor any particular sector or category of taxpayers?
In fact, when I look at the changes that the Finance Act brings, it brings me back to the basics of taxation, which we know as the canons of taxation. There must be some degree of certainty, simplicity, and efficiency in what is being proposed as a tax. I would think that those changes, they do tick the boxes. The solidarity tax is there since it's not new. I mean, it has existed, the threshold, and has changed recently. But for me, it is comprehensive. The taxation regime that is being proposed is comprehensive, obviously from a legal point of view, but from a business community perspective, it may be different at a time when the COVID has just hit us. Whether it was the right time to levy such a tax, this is obviously debatable.
Let's talk about the levy specifically, Mr. Noor Mohamed Uzair. From the MRA perspective, could you maybe tell us what are the practical changes in the Finance Act, and more specifically relating to this solidarity levy?
The solidarity levy, I'll call it SL just to be more practical. In fact, it was introduced by the Finance Act 2017. And it came into operation for your assessment, 18-19. So this year is the second year, and this year is the year in which the changes have been brought. So what are the conditions that were applicable for the first year? It is a tax of 5% on that part of what we call the leviable income that exceeds 3.5 million. What is leviable income? It's simply chargeable income plus exempt dividend. So it is a tax of 5% on that part of the leviable income, which means that it is paid by high income earners only. So if a person earns like 4 million rupees in a year, and with all the deductions he has got a chargeable income more than 3.5 million, then he will pay a tax of 5% on that excess. What has changed now? As from this year, the threshold of 3.5 million has been reduced to 3 million. And what has happened is that the rate of 5% has been increased to 25%. So somebody has a tendency to say, oh, 25% plus 15%, so it comes to 40%. So it's very much on the high side. So in fact, in the Finance Act, you will note that there is a cap to this. So nobody will pay tax at a rate more than 25% because the solidarity levy is capped at 10% of the net income. Net income, of course, plus the exempt dividend. So this is what has happened. Now, there is a criticism that, of course, there is a cap, but this cap works better for those who have got very high income, which means that if you look at the criticism is that if you look at the marginal rate of tax, so what tax you pay on each additional rupee that you get if you are like earning more than 3 million. For each rupee you get tax of 15% plus 25% of levy, which comes to 40% when we talk about the marginal tax rate. But then, on the other hand, we could also say that why should we look at the marginal tax rate? We could look at the effective tax rate, because at the end of the day, what's interesting, what interests an individual? how much I earn, how much tax I'll pay. So because of the capping of 10% of income, a person will pay at a maximum of 25%. So the one who gets 3.5 million or 4 million, he will pay 10%, he will pay 15% on the chargeable income, and then 25% of that part that exceeds 3 million. When we calculate the effective tax rate, it will be around 16% to 19%. And as the income of the person increases, the effective tax rate increases. So it's the reasoning, the result is exactly the contrary when we talk about the marginal tax rate. So in fact, it is not that unfair in the sense that, of course, when we look at effective tax rate, the more you earn, your tax rate is higher.
Ryan, alas, Mr. Uzier just explained, clarified lots of things. But indeed, at some point in time, we had the impression that there was an element of double take between what was announced, what was discussed, and what was finally adopted. Is the overall philosophy of the changes now clearer and more objective to you?
I think yes. When the measure was announced in the budget, there was the fact that it will be increased from 5% to 25%. There was, of course, the reduction of the threshold. And there was also the fact that it would not have been applicable to non-citizens who are resident in Mauritius. But in the Finance Act, it has been clarified that all Mauritian residents, whether you are a non-citizen or a citizen, if you are resident in Mauritius, because tax is on residency, not on citizenship, and they would be subject to the same solidarity levy. And of course, the issue of the rate of 25%, there was a feeling that the effective tax rate will be between 15% to 40%. Then in the Finance Act, the limit of 10% was introduced, so that even if there is a solidarity levy of 25%, but it's not as simple as that. You have to do another calculation, 10% of the leviable income, whichever is lower.
Lowest.
Which means that in any case, your total effective tax rate cannot be more than, should be less than 25%. It will be 24.99 something, from 15% to 24.99. Those who will be more affected will be those who are in the income range between 3 million to 3.5 million, because they were not subject to solidarity levy in the past. Now they will be paying solidarity levy, and probably with the highest effective tax rate. It's true that at the start, the more your income increases, it's progressive. Your effective tax rate increase. But then arriving at a point where it will start to decrease. So it's a progressive, but then it becomes a regressive. Because the more you derive, for example, the effective tax rate for someone deriving 10 million rupees will be less than someone deriving 5 million rupees.
Let's turn back to Mr. Noor Mahmoud Uzier. Let's talk about what is new, tangible, and already working. I'm speaking namely about new tax holidays, double deduction, and tax credits. Could you elaborate on what changed and what was introduced in the Finance Act relating to those?
In fact, there are a series of changes that have been brought in the Finance Act. I mean, each of these changes have got a very clear objective. I mean, income derived from inland aquaculture this is an area where government want to promote this type of activity, and there is a tax holiday of 8 years. Of course, there are other conditions attached to it. And then there is the what was mentioned earlier. The government want to encourage the setting up of a university campus in respect of the good universities. So if you set up a campus in Mauritius where the university is among the 500 top posts, there are tax incentive as well for 8 years. It's a tax exempt for 8 years. Income derived by manufacturing nutraceutical products. This is again an area where government want to promote this type of activity, and there are 8 years, successive years of income are exempt. We have got, as we stated earlier, the double deduction that has been introduced with respect to investment in research, medical research and development. You have got double deduction because you have got a specific deduction for that research, and you have got the annual allowance as well. You have got franchises as well, where government has allowed to deduct twice, and you have got tax credit in respect of manufacturing companies who incurs capital expenditure on new plant and machinery. So these are the main elements that have been introduced in the Finance Act as incentives for companies to invest.
Kevin Ramkalon, for quite some years now, Mauritius has been boasting on the clarity of its tax system to actually attract investment and new residents. Does this fiscal policy, do these tax measures actually put Mauritius in a better position to attract investment, keep entrepreneurs in business, and help others actually grow?
To be fair, the old tax system, which was very clear and simple of 15%, had to be relooked at as we are moving towards a high-income economy. When we talk about BEPS, etc., there were reasons to relook at the fiscal policy. But we talk about attracting investors. I think we have to raise the debate from tax into competitiveness. Tax is one element of competitiveness, as is ease of doing business, as is how attractive you are for different things, what is the size of your market, etc., etc. All those things considered, I think we need to ensure that when looking at the competitiveness of Mauritius, we continue being a pole of attraction for investors. Today, unfortunately, the FDI, the rate of private investment is perhaps not as high as you would like. There's the context, there's COVID, and there's the world pandemic. But we should be sure that whatever we are putting in place remains attractive, remains also coherent to the tenets of taxation. We have perhaps talked about the incentives. I mean, they are obviously in the overall equation important when you're choosing where to invest and how to invest. We have also to look at the CSG, which came a little bit after the Finance Act in a regulation, but which basically is a tax on payroll that is introduced against a contributive pension system. So it replaces a contributive pension system by a payroll tax to fund basic retirement pension. So the costs of doing business overall, I think, remain extremely important for the country in our overall competitiveness, but not at the detriment of ease of doing business, not at the detriment of market size, etc. So competitiveness, we'll have to be very, very careful on it as we move forward.
Let's turn back to No Mamadouzi now, relating to some other taxation measures which caught the eye of many people in Mauritius, namely the changes in VAT relating to electronic services from foreign suppliers. What are the changes, and how will VAT actually be applied?
In fact, I think it's important to understand the principle behind this measure. What's happening nowadays is that whenever a local supplier supplies digital or electronic service, this local supplier is VAT registered. So when providing that product, the local supplier will charge the VAT and will collect the VAT from the user, the purchaser. What happens, because digital electronic service is not like goods that has to go through the customs. It can be supplied by a foreign supplier. What happens is that foreign supplier supplies that same product. That foreign supplier is not subject to VAT, is not registered for VAT, and what's happening is that this local supplier finds itself in a position of
Unfair competition.
Unfair competition. I mean, there is no level playing field in the sense that how will he compute? So, how will he compete? So the whole idea is to protect our local operators, so that to put them in a level playing field with the foreign suppliers. This is the basic principle about the VAT. There are a lot that has been said, but this is the basics. Now, how is it going to be implemented? How are we going to register a foreign supplier for VAT purposes? How are we going to collect the VAT from a foreign supplier? There are many ways of doing so. One of the ways is that we can find a system where the foreign supplier will have to appoint an agent locally, and that agent will act on behalf of the foreign. This is one of the ways. And another thing that maybe I should draw the attention when we talk about digital or electronic service, which type of digital service, which type of electronic service, all these have got to be clarified, and they will be clarified in the appropriate regulations. But what has been passed in the Finance Act, it's about making the foreign supplier with respect to the local supplier on level playing field. This is the principle behind this measure.
Avinagor, it sounds like it appears that the so-called Netflix tax that we're talking about is now a trend. Should we expect such tax to be here in the long run now and to be part of the scenery?
Yeah, as you said, Rabin, it's the trend. If we look at other places around the world, they have, for the last, let's say, 5 to 10 years, there have been an attempt to tax those digital services. As you said it, well, we call it a Netflix tax, but it would apply to anyone providing video on-demand services over the internet, and even online gaming, online gambling. Basically, it's those services you are providing online. We've seen, let's take, for example, in the EU, they tried to introduce an EU-wide tax. It couldn't be adopted unanimously. Then we've seen that a number of countries have adopted local legislation to impose such a Netflix tax, like France, Belgium, I think Italy also has it. When it comes to Mauritius, we can say that we are mostly following the trend, let's say in Philippines or Mexico, where in the light of the pandemic, those countries found that there was an increased number of people who were subscribing to those services, and they said, wow, that could be a good way of generating revenue. Maybe for those countries, but we have to look at the specifics of Mauritius. We're a small country. Those companies, as the law says, they are foreign suppliers. They don't have a place of business here. They don't have any connection with Mauritius. The service is coming over the internet. Fair enough, we impose such an obligation on them to pay the VAT here. They have to be registered with the MRA. How do we enforce that law? This is the big question. Maybe we will find some elements to answer this question in the regulations that would eventually be promulgated, because now what the Finance Act provides is, okay, there will be such a tax, but the details of which will be set out in a regulation. So we need to see those regulations to see how they would be applied. But coming to your question, this is something which is inevitable. We see the trend, more and more countries at least addressing their mind to apply such a tax, be it Australia, New Zealand, even in Africa. I know last year I was reading an article, Kenya was planning to introduce such a tax. But it's a completely different thing of thinking of introducing the tax, actually introducing the tax, and seeing how you apply it. Coming back to the canons of taxation, is it cost effective to recover those taxes, or can it backfire? Because you may have a particular service provider who would say, my clientele in Mauritius is so insignificant for me that I may decide to ban my services for that particular jurisdiction. Because when you look at it from the point of view of that tech giant who is servicing, let's say, a global market, do they need to comply with tax laws locally in each country? There is the debate, let's say, internationally, there are two schools of thought. For VAT application, you have one school of thought which will tell you that you need to apply it where the product, the service is actually produced. There is another school of thought which talks about the destination principle. So where the service is actually consumed, this is where you would apply the tax. The major limitation of taxation is that it is geographic in nature. Mauritius can only enact tax laws which it would apply in Mauritius. How can we use the long arm of the law to impose a tax on a foreign supplier can be quite challenging for a country like Mauritius.
Reinhard, maybe quickly, your thoughts about the pros and cons of such a policy?
No, for me, when I find it strange when people talk about Netflix tax, because VAT is a tax on consumption. And the general principle of VAT is that VAT should be applied where a service or a goods is consumed. For a goods, when you import a goods, you pay VAT at the customs, whether you are an individual or you are a VAT registered person. But for a service, there is already a system of reverse charge. We call it a reverse charge mechanism, whereby if someone imports services from outside Mauritius, because you're not at customs, the services doesn't come through customs, it's the customer who pays the VAT, as if he is the seller, and if he is authorized to do so, he claims the VAT. Since the enactment of the VAT legislation, it was applicable only on registered persons, because it's easy for the MRA to go and look at VAT registered persons where they have imported services from overseas and if they apply reverse charge. A few years ago, the government tried to extend this to non-VAT registered persons. But it's very difficult, because that would mean that I import services. I need to collect the VAT from me and remit to the MRA. Because I'm not a registered person, I will not deduct any VAT. So for me, it will be a cost. It was very difficult to put in practice. I think that's why the government maybe has changed the policy to try to catch up with final consumers. Because, to be clear, that's why I say that Netflix tax is not a new tax. Because if us, Rogers Capital, we are registered, VAT registered person, we take a Netflix subscription, we need to pay VAT on it through reverse charge. It's only when final consumers, me as an individual, I was not liable to VAT. Now I will be liable. And what I understand from the new legislation is that even Rogers Capital, who was applying reverse charge in the past, now no longer has to apply reverse charge on digital services, because now it will be up to the foreign supplier to collect VAT, as if he has a business presence in Mauritius. I think this has been introduced a few years ago in South Africa, but in practice, it's a bit challenging. We'll need to see whether the cost-benefit of implementing this tax would be worth.
Let's turn to Richard Lee now. One of the major changes brought by the Finance Act is the overhauling of the National Pensions Fund and its replacement by the new Contribution Sociale Généralisée for the non-French speakers. It's a general social contribution. Richard Lee, could you explain what this change is, and maybe tell us whether you think it's a welcome one.
You've said it, Robin. I think a lot of people believe what has been said about a replacement of the NPF by the CSG, which is the Contribution Sociale Généralisée. But when you look at it in actual fact within its roots, as announced in the budget speech, it's not really a replacement. Why do I say that? Is because when you replace something, you have a collection, which is basically a pension contribution. You have a benefit. And if you replace it, you have to replace both. So you have to also replace whatever you're contributing also by a benefit. In here, we have a benefit and a payment for the NPF, but for the CSG, there is only a payment. There is no clear linkage between what this payment would actually provide. Now, to really understand what the Contribution Sociale Généralisée is and the NPF, I think it's important that we go back to the roots and understand what is the pension landscape in Mauritius. In Mauritius, we have what we call as a tiered pension landscape. The first one is a tier 0 or tier 1, whatever you want to call it. It is the basic retirement pension. And the aim and goal of a basic retirement pension is to basically provide for enough income to those who are socially below a certain level of income so that they can be out of the poverty level and be able to live a decent. And that is the reason why any funding for this type of pension is usually made out of tax because it's collected by everybody. There is no contribution of whatever you want to call it, pension contribution that basically links to a benefit. Everybody, the mass collects it, and you pay for those socially marginalized people. Then you have the second tier. The second tier is what we used to have as the National Pension Fund, or the NPF. And the National Pension Fund works exactly like a pension fund, which means its aim is to provide a replacement income in retirement. So somebody today earns a level of income, enjoys a level of quality of life. In retirement, that person is supposed to continue enjoying this quality of life. And that is why he pays contribution which is linked to its salary and income, so that when it comes to retirement, he gets a replacement income that is also linked to the salary and income at the moment of retirement. And then the third tier is the pension provision by the private sector. I have to say that the NPF is a contributory pension scheme for the private sector only. So the change today is that the NPF has been abolished. I use the exact word that was used in the budget speech. It hasn't said it has been replaced. It says the NPF has been abolished. So today, an employer and employee will no longer pay the NPF contribution and would also no longer be entitled to benefit from future accrual of pension. So in the past, NPF was contributed at a rate of 3% of a cap, which is roughly around 18,000 rupees. That is the NPF ceiling, to give you a benefit at retirement or to target a benefit at around 18,000. Now, the CSG, or the Contribution Sociale Généralisée, today is basically using the same rate, or pretty much the same rate. So it's 3% for those who earn more than 50,000 and 1.5% for those below that income. And what does the benefit of this contribution or Contribution Sociale Généralisée? Like Kevin mentioned before, it is purely, I think most of us can see it, purely a tax charge on payroll.
So should we call it a payroll tax instead of calling it a CSG?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think even where in French, l'étymologie, the word itself is borrowed from the French, they call it there in France a payroll tax. So that is universally accepted. It's nothing to do with pension. And I think what has been said by a lot of people is that the contribution or the tax being collected is meant to fund for a promise for an increase in that BRP or basic retirement pension. So I think if you look at it in terms of business perspective, especially for those who are watching us on Zoom, there are companies where the payroll, where you have a lot of your workforce which is earning less than 50,000 rupees, you will pay 1.5% as an employee, but 3% as an employer. And on the CSG, on the NPF, on the NPF, you would have paid more. So if you compare like with like, it is true that some or many employees, especially those in SMEs who employ low-income workers, would probably see less coming out of their pocket. But the flip side of this is, which is something that many people don't see, is that their employees would probably be worse off. And if you do care for your employees, I think a lot of employers would find that they will have to top up to be able to provide for the abolishment of the NPF as well as pay the CSG.
Speaking of employees, Richard Lee, another major change that was already in the works before the Finance Act is the Portable Retirement Gratuity Fund. Some alterations were made to its implementation. Could you explain those?
Yeah. So the PRGF, or the Portable Retirement Gratuity Fund, basically refers back to what the Labour Act called the retirement gratuity. In Mauritius, like in many countries, so when one employee works, they accrue a benefit. So under the Labour Act, which has now been replaced or repealed by the Workers' Rights Act, for every year of service, you basically, an employee, accrue half a month of salary. So if somebody worked for 40 years, they will get 20 months of salary as a lump sum. And that has always been here. There is no change to the benefit. The only thing that has changed with the PRGF and the workers' rights legislation is the implementation of a funding mechanism. In the past, there were many cases where some employers would have this on their liability, on their books, but in the end, they either go bankrupt or there are certain circumstances that happen which basically makes them unable to pay for their employees. And it is precisely for this reason that the Workers' Rights Act basically implemented the PRGF, so that employers today have to pay 4.5% of a person's remuneration and put it in a fund, what we call the PRGF, and that will be used to pay for this retirement gratuity at retirement. But essentially nothing has been changed fundamentally, because when somebody retire, it will still be subject to this formula, as what we call the defined benefit formula of half a month of service, half a month of remuneration for every years of service. And even if the PRGF doesn't have enough money, i.e. if the 4.5% per month is not enough to pay for that benefit, the employer would have to take out of pocket and top up for it.
Kevin Ramkalon, is that why the business community is still, and Business Mauritius is actually still advocating for fine-tunings in the PRGF policy?
Well, the PRGF, I think, is now ready to be rolled. What we've asked for is for it to be deferred because of the context, because as from the dates implemented, you need to back pay all the obligations that you have, and in this particular context, it's extremely difficult to do it. Perhaps the few things on PRGF where we still need to discuss is what do you do with employees that actually are being laid off for gross misconduct, because you still need to pay, and such very minor things. But generally, I think on PRGF, there's an agreement that has been reached, and the PRGF will be implemented in 2022, as from January 2022. But of course, again, it all adds to the cost of doing business. Each additional legislation adds to it.
We've been together for a little more than an hour and a half, so we're reaching the end of the session. But before the end, we have a few more questions. You've been sending quite a few questions. We'll be taking 4 of them. So let me take the first question, which is a question that I think Mr. Uzier and Mr. Alas could answer. The question reads as follows: could you please clarify the definition of earnings of foreign citizens resident in Mauritius, which are subject to tax, at what rate, and whether solidarity levy, applies to them?
Foreign citizens resident in
Mauritius,
yeah.
which are subject to tax.
In fact, the foreign citizens resident in Mauritius are taxable on the income they derive from Mauritius and income they derive from abroad, subject to the income being remitted to Mauritius. And now, if that income is subject to some tax in the foreign jurisdiction, of course, they will have the tax credit when computing their tax. I mean, if you want to add anything to
I think just Mr. Uzier just summarized it perfectly. We have a worldwide tax system, but individuals are taxable fully on income derived from Mauritius and on income derived overseas but remitted to Mauritius. And solidarity levy fall into the definition of income tax in the tax legislation. So any foreign tax suffered on foreign source income can be claimed as a tax credit, not only against normal tax payable, but also against solidarity levy.
Another question maybe to you, Mr. Uzier. Is the solidarity levy applicable on the earnings of non-citizen residents that are remitted outside Mauritius?
Solidarity levy is applicable to residents of Mauritius. Now, how the solidarity levy is calculated, there is 25% of the chargeable income plus exempt dividend, which exceeds 3 million. Now, what is in chargeable income? In chargeable income, you will get only that part of the income that is taxable in Mauritius. And what is that part of income that is taxable in Mauritius? It's that part of income for an individual, foreign source income, remitted to Mauritius. So then it's very easy to calculate. I mean, this is the manner in which it has to be calculated.
Maybe another question to maybe both of you gentlemen, or Mr. Uzier or Arvind. It was mentioned that there would be tax incentives for those who work from home during lockdown. How to avail of these?
I think that the tax incentives for those who are working from home, the legislation is already in place, and there is, I think, double deduction for the wages that the employer pay in respect to those work from home schemes. But there are conditions attached to it, and if the employers comply with these conditions, they will be entitled to those double deductions with respect to the salaries paid.
I have a last question for Ryan Alas. The question reads as follows, Mr. Ryan Alas: does the introduction of CSG and solidarity levy indicate a movement towards a progressive tax system?
That's a very good question. In fact, there's nothing bad with a regressive tax system. And there are many countries who have a progressive. Tax system. But personally, I believe that a progressive tax system is more suited to economies that have mineral resources, oil and gas resources, where it's more the investor who needs the country than otherwise. For us, we need to take into consideration that our Income Tax Act, 1995, is normally viewed as a tax-friendly. We encourage investors worldwide to use our international financial center we have provided a lot of vehicles to those investors. What I'm afraid of is if we move towards a progressive tax system, we will now find ourselves in a position that it will be Mauritian residents that will try to use these vehicles. So I think that's not the objective of the government, and hope it will not be so.
Kevin, would you add on that?
I think it's been well said. The attractiveness of Mauritius as a global headquarters scheme, as a place where you can do business in the region. I think this is it. We don't have many other resources unless we discover oil tomorrow in our seas, and that too, at the price of oil these days. I think we need to be very, very clear about our strategy. And again, I would like to bring it more on the perhaps economic side. I think before we implement any new legislation, tax or otherwise, but that affects businesses and our positioning, I think we need to have an impact assessment. We're not against any form of reforms, but we need to really understand as a country what are the impact of such reforms, and then take an educated decision.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. We've just reached the end of our panel discussion, which went just a little bit over an hour and a half. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you to our friends of Rogers Capital here who hosted this discussion. And stay in touch with Rogers Capital through their newsletters and the social media for the next event, a webinar of this type that will be organized in the very near future. Thank you very much for following us. See you soon.